10 months after our divorce, my ex-mother-in-law spotted me at the hospital and smirked. "Divorcing you was the best decision my son ever made. He has a baby boy now with your best friend." I just smiled and said, "Are you sure that's his baby?" 5 minutes later, a man walked into the room, and when she saw who he was, the smug smile vanished from her face. "Leaving you was the best decision my son ever made." Marjorie Larch said it in a hospital hallway, smiling like she'd rehearsed the line the whole drive over from Forest Highlands. "My name is Nadia Solberg," and I let her finish. "He has a baby boy now." She paused there, watching for the crack she'd come to see. "With your best friend." 10 months ago, almost to the day, a courthouse clerk in Coconino County had stamped my divorce final and handed the paper back across the counter like it was nothing more than a parking ticket. 10 months ago, a sentence like that one would have put me on the floor of this hallway. But I'd just come from an OR, where a 19-year-old named Diego had a spleen laceration bad enough that the ER attending gave him even odds over the phone. I'd spent 3 hours with my hands inside him. I'd won. He was in recovery now, breathing on his own. And somewhere down this same hallway, his mother was crying, the good kind of tears into a hospital chaplain's shoulder. I still had a fleck of his blood dried into the crease of my thumbnail. It was my third case of the day. The kind of Tuesday that made the rest of the week feel like a vacation. Outside, the monsoon had rolled in over the peaks an hour early, and I could still hear rain hammering the skylights 2 floors up. The sound that always meant our ED was about to get busy in ways that had nothing to do with the weather itself and everything to do with what wet asphalt did to people. Driving too fast on mountain roads they thought they knew, so Marjorie Larch, in her cream cashmere and her rehearsed cruelty, did not have the kind of power over me she believed she had. Not anymore. I let myself really look at her, maybe for the first time since the settlement. She was thinner than I remembered. The cardigan that used to fit her like armor at every Larch family dinner hung loose at her shoulders now, and when she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her hand came up flat to the center of her chest. There and gone so fast that anyone who hadn't spent 6 years learning exactly what that gesture can mean would have missed it completely. I didn't miss it, but her heart wasn't my business anymore. She'd made very sure of that, the day her family's lawyer slid the settlement across a conference table and she watched me sign it without once looking up from her manicure. She'd worn that same cardigan. I remembered now, to the last Thanksgiving I'd spent at that house. The year she seated me at the far end of the table beside the caterer's assistant, instead of anywhere near her own family, and called it an oversight when I finally asked. I used to catalogue moments like that one back then, filing each small cruelty away as proof I was imagining things. That a woman who hosted a coat drive for the shelter every December couldn't possibly also be capable of what she was doing to me in her own dining room. It took me longer than I'm proud of to stop needing the coat drive, to cancel out the seating chart. I always wondered, she went on, when I didn't give her the reaction she'd driven 40 minutes for, what a girl from Sunnyside thought she was going to do with a man like my son. You were never going to be enough for this family, Nadia. I think some part of you always knew that. Is that really what you believe? I asked her. She blinked like she'd expected tears and gotten a question instead. Excuse me? That losing me was the best thing that ever happened to Grady. I kept my voice level, the same voice I use in a consult room when the news isn't good, but the patient is going to live anyway. Is that really what you believe, Marjorie? Because from where I'm standing, your son traded a wife who operates on strangers for free at the county clinic on her one day off for a woman who used to borrow $20 from me at lunch and forget to pay it back for a month. I just want to be sure I understand the victory correctly, since you drove all this way to explain it to me. A flicker crossed her face. Not doubt, not quite. Something thinner than that, gone before I could name it. You always did think you were smarter than this family. No. I picked an invisible fleck of lint off my scrub top, mostly to give my hand something to do besides shake. I just stopped needing this family to agree with me. Her chin lifted a fraction, the way it always did right before she said something she'd later insist was simply honest. Your mother still pushes a housekeeping cart around this building, doesn't she? 4 floors up from where we're standing, I'd imagine. I always found that almost sweet in its way. Some people know exactly where they belong. There it was. The real thing finally underneath everything else she'd dressed it up as. She does, I said. 3rd floor now, actually. She trained the entire environmental services team on infection protocol during the surge. And this hospital still runs her system 4 years later. You should ask someone about it sometime, since you're here so often these days. I hadn't meant that last part as a question. I watched her hear it as one anyway, watched the flicker before she smoothed her face back into something composed. She opened her mouth to say something else, and that was when the overhead paging system cut through the hallway in the flat. Unhurried voice hospitals reserved for things that are anything but unhurried. Trauma team to the ED. Trauma team to the ED. Multiple incoming. I didn't move yet. Alerts like that ran a dozen times a shift in the only level 1 trauma center for 140 miles in any direction. The place every bad mile of I-40 and I-17 eventually fed into. It wasn't mine until somebody said my name. Somebody said my name 19 seconds later. Rowan's steed came around the corner at the kind of jog that still somehow looked unhurried. The way it always did, like his body had learned a long time ago. In some much worse place than this hallway, that panic never made anyone's hands steadier. He was already in his trauma gown, a tablet in one hand, blood that wasn't his own drying on the cuff of his other sleeve. 4 years we'd worked the same trauma bay together, and I had never once seen him raise his voice. I'd seen him work a chest wound with rounds still going off 2 streets away, or so the story went, among the nurses who'd trained under him before I ever got here. Solberg. I need you. He didn't slow down for whatever he was walking into, didn't seem to register Marjorie at all, except as an obstacle to angle around. Semi-jackknifed on 40 just west of town in that storm cell that blew through. 4 vehicles caught behind it in the rain. 2 critical inbound, one's a kid, maybe 9 years old. Twists elbow deep in a gallbladder and won't. Surface for 40 minutes. How critical? Critical enough that I came to find you myself instead of calling. That got my attention. In a way nothing about Marjorie Larch would ever manage. Again, I'm in, I said, and I was already moving. I looked back once. At the door, Marjorie stood exactly where I'd left her, her hand still pressed unconsciously now, flat against the center of her chest. The smile she'd walked in with, the one she must have built this whole trip around, the one that said I destroyed you and I'm proud of it, was gone. In its place was an expression I recognized from 100 family members standing in 100 hospital corridors, just like this one, waiting on news they weren't ready for, fear small and unwilling, and trying very hard not to show itself. I didn't have time to wonder why. I turned and followed Rowan through the double doors, already building the trauma bay in my mind before I'd even seen the patient. Already doing the things 6 years of training had built into my hands and my heart both, setting aside, on command, the fact that 10 minutes ago, a woman who used to call herself my family had driven all the way from Forest Highlands just to make me feel small in a hallway, and had almost succeeded. I didn't know it yet. Jogging toward Bay 2, with my pulse still climbing from a fight I never started. I didn't know that the next time I stood this close to Marjorie Larch, it wouldn't be her cruelty keeping me up at night. It would be her heart in my hands. Same as everyone else's. Chapter 2, Sunnyside Girl. I grew up 4 floors below where I now spend most of my life, in the break room behind the Environmental Services office, doing algebra homework at a folding table while my mother emptied linen carts. Astrid Solberg has worked at Flagstaff Medical Center for 26 years. She started the same year I started kindergarten, back when it was still just called the hospital by everyone in Sunnyside, the way you'd say the store or the church, like there was only one that mattered. She used to walk me the 6 blocks from Killip Elementary on days she couldn't get anyone to watch me, sit me down with my times tables, and go push a cart through corridors that smelled like bleach, and underneath that, like something more serious than bleach could ever fully cover, I used to watch the doctors. I didn't watch them with any particular awe. I watched how they moved, fast without ever looking rushed. How a code team could turn a hallway electric in an instant, everyone pulled toward the same point at once. I decided somewhere around age 9 that I wanted to be a person a room organized itself around. My mother says I never once wanted to be anything else after that, not a teacher, not a vet, nothing. Just that. She used to tell people her daughter was going to be a doctor, the same way other mothers said their kids liked dinosaurs, like it was a phase that was sort of sweet. I don't think she really believed it could happen, not because she doubted me, but because nobody she knew had ever done it. Sunnyside sent kids to Coconino Community College, or the Mill if it was still hiring, or the Army. It didn't send them to medical school. It sent me to Northern Arizona University first, 6 blocks the other direction, on a scholarship that covered tuition and not much else. I was working the front desk at the rec center on campus the semester I met Grady Larch, who came in twice a week to play racquetball with friends, whose last names I'd later learn belonged on buildings. He was easy to talk to back then. I want to be fair about that even now. He asked good questions and actually waited for the answers, which at 20 was rarer than it should have been. He didn't seem to notice or care that I drove a car with a passenger door that only opened from the outside, or that I picked up shifts at a clinic on 4th Street that didn't turn anyone away for lack of insurance. For a while that felt like enough. The first time I met his mother, she asked me, in front of 11 other people at a table, set for a dinner I hadn't known was that formal, what exactly my father did for work. He passed when I was 6, I told her. It's just been my mom. How resourceful of her, Marjorie said, and reached for her wine, and the conversation moved on to someone's regatta, and I sat there understanding all at once and completely that I had just been weighed, and a number had been written down somewhere I'd never see. I married her son anyway. That part deserves honesty too. Love makes you believe you can out-earn a debt that was never really about money. For the first 2 years, I almost did. Grady drove up to Sunnyside every Sunday that first winter, sat at my mother's kitchen table eating her pozole like it was the best thing he'd ever tasted, which it was, and asked her questions about her work the same patient way he'd once asked me about mine. My mother liked him. I liked who I was when I was around him, someone who'd earned a soft life without apologizing for wanting one. We got married in a small ceremony at the Shrine of the Red Rocks outside Sedona. 60 guests, and for exactly as long as it took me to finish my surgical residency. I believed we'd built something that belonged to just the 2 of us, and nobody else's approval. I was wrong about the nobody else part. I just didn't find out how wrong until residency ended, and I finally had time to notice what I'd been too exhausted to see. The 9-year-old from the pile-up was named Wesley, and by the time Rowan and I got him open, he'd lost enough blood that 2 units in. The anesthesiologist looked at me over the drape and didn't say anything, because we'd worked together long enough that he didn't have to. I found the bleed on the 4th pass, a splenic tear worse than the scan had suggested. The kind that kills fast and quiet if you're not looking exactly where it's hiding. Rowan called out numbers in a voice that never changed pitch, no matter what those numbers were doing, and I worked. And somewhere outside, the storm was still coming down hard enough that I heard it even through 2 floors of concrete. We saved him. We saved all 4 of them in the end, though the driver of the sedan that got hit broadest would be in the ICU for a week, and the truck driver would carry a limp for the rest of his life. Wesley would carry a scar and, his mother told me later in the hallway, a story he'd probably tell at parties someday about the time he got hit by a semi and lived. His mother hugged me in the corridor outside recovery, still shaking, still in the clothes she'd thrown on when the highway patrol called her. She smelled like the inside of a car that had been driven too fast for too long, and she held onto my arm like she wasn't sure her legs would keep working without something to grip. I've had 100 moments like that one in 6 years of this work, and not one of them has ever gotten easier. And not one of them has ever stopped being the entire reason I do this. It is a different kind of power than the kind Marjorie Larch understands. I don't think she's ever once considered that the two might not be the same thing. Rowan found me afterward in the surgeon's lounge, both of us still in scrub caps, both of us too wired to sit down. "Good hands today," he said, which from him was closer to a standing ovation than most surgeons ever gave each other. "Good hands every day," I said. "You're just now noticing," he almost smiled. Rowan Steed smiling all the way was a rare enough thing that the nurses used to keep an informal count. Back before I made attending and started noticing things like that myself. "You want coffee that isn't from the machine in the ED," he said. "There's a place on Route 66 that opens at 5. It's 10 at night. They open at 5 in the morning, Solberg. I'm asking if you want to still be here when it does." I told him I had a shift in 6 hours and needed at least 4 of sleep in there somewhere, which was true, and which was also, if I'm being honest, the first time in almost a year I'd had to remind myself of a reason to say no to something that sounded like it might be nice. He nodded, easy about it, no wounded pride in it at all, which I'd come to learn was very much the whole of who he was. Another time, I was almost to my car in the staff lot. Rain finally letting up into the kind of fine mist that Flagstaff specializes in after a big storm, when I ran into Priya from the cath lab, still in her badge and lanyard, heading the opposite direction toward the parking structure. "Rough one tonight," she said. "Heard you and Steed pulled a kid through." "We did. Good, we had a rough one too earlier. Older woman, cardiology consult, arrhythmia workup. Kept trying to leave before Dr. Ferrer was even done explaining the monitor to her." Priya shook her head. The particular tired shake of someone who'd spent her whole shift arguing with a patient who didn't want to be a patient. "Larch," I think her name was. "You believe some people would rather die of stubbornness than let anyone see them scared." I stood very still in the parking lot mist, keys already halfway to the ignition of my hand, and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the weather. Cardiology, not a routine physical, not the kind of appointment you casually mention to your daughter-in-law while you're busy telling her she doesn't matter. An arrhythmia workup meant somebody's heart wasn't keeping proper time. It meant a doctor somewhere in this building had already looked at Marjorie Larch's chart and decided it was worth watching closely. I told myself all the way home that it wasn't my business. I told myself the whole drive up Beaver Street, past the dark windows of the co-op, past the empty lot where they used to run the farmers' market before it moved, that a woman who had spent an hour manufacturing my humiliation in a public hallway did not get to also live in my head afterward, worrying me. I almost believed it by the time I got home. I did not believe it at all by morning, standing in my kitchen in yesterday's scrubs with my badge already clipped on and my phone open in my hand to a number I had absolutely no business dialing. My thumb hovered over the call button for longer than I want to admit. I did not call. But I understood, standing there in the grey 5 a.m. light with my coffee going cold, that not calling was going to take a great deal more discipline than I'd promised myself it would the night before. Chapter 3. What the statement showed. I did not call the cath lab the next morning to ask about Marjorie Larch's chart. I want that on the record, because it would have been easy, and because for about 4 hours I genuinely believed I wasn't going to. Then I got to the hospital, pulled my badge through the scanner outside the surgeon's locker room, and thought about her hand pressed flat to her chest in that hallway. And I understood that some part of me had already decided the night before. I just hadn't admitted it to myself yet. I didn't call. I looked her up through the legitimate channel instead, the one any physician can use to check whether a patient in the system might cross paths with a procedure they're scheduled for, and confirmed what Priya had already told me. Arrhythmia workup. Ongoing. Nothing urgent yet, according to the chart, which was its own kind of relief and its own kind of unfinished business. I closed the window and went to check on Wesley, whose mother was asleep in the recliner beside his bed, still in her rain-damp jacket, one hand resting on the rail like she could hold him here through sheer will if the machines ever wavered. I stood in the doorway a moment longer than I needed to, and told myself that was the end of my thinking about Marjorie Larch for the day. Whitney Duren and I met in the 9th grade. Assigned as lab partners in a biology class neither of us cared much about, and stayed close for 19 years after that in the particular way you only manage with someone who knew you before you became whoever you turned into. She was the one who drove me to my MCAT at 5 in the morning because my car wouldn't start, who sat in a Denny's parking lot for 6 hours reading a paperback so I wouldn't have to be alone with the waiting. She was maid of honor at my wedding. She cried harder than my own mother did, which at the time I thought was just Whitney being Whitney, big feelings, worn loud and close to the surface. Her own life had been harder than mine in ways I didn't always notice. Back then, too wrapped up in my own long hours to look closely. 2 jobs, neither of them the kind that led anywhere, a mother who needed more from her than a mother should. I used to think that was exactly why we worked as friends. 2 Sunnyside girls who understood without having to explain it what it cost to want more than the neighborhood expected of you. She was also, it turned out, the person Grady called at 11 at night during my 2nd year of residency, the years I was working 80-hour weeks and coming home too tired to do anything but sleep in the same bed as a man I loved and barely saw. I didn't know that then. I only knew that Whitney started coming around the house more, bringing takeout, sitting with Grady while I was on call, being exactly the kind of friend I was, too exhausted to be grateful enough for. I found the statement in March, doing our joint taxes at the kitchen table on one of my rare Sundays off. The year residency finally ended, and I had enough waking hours to actually look at our finances instead of just signing where Grady told me to sign, a hotel by the interstate, one of the chain ones with a waffle bar and a name that sounds like every other hotel on every other exit. 6 charges over 4 months, always a Tuesday or a Thursday, always while I was on a rotation that had me in the building for 36 hours straight. I didn't confront him with the statement first. I sat with it for 2 days, the way you sit with a scan result before you say the word out loud to the family in the waiting room, making absolutely sure of what you're looking at before you hand somebody a truth that's going to break something open. Then I laid the printed pages on the kitchen table between us and asked him to explain the charges. And I watched my husband's face do the thing faces do when there's genuinely nothing left to say. He didn't deny it. I'll give him that much, even now. He just sat there and let the silence answer for him. The same silence Marjorie would use in that hospital hallway all these months later, though I didn't know yet that the 2 of them shared that particular family trait. The divorce moved fast, faster than I understood divorces were supposed to move, and it took me the better part of a year to understand why. The Larch family lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Osgood, who'd clearly had this exact conversation with clients before, presented a settlement within 6 weeks that split our modest joint accounts evenly and said nothing at all about the surgical practice equity I'd earned co-managing the trauma program's outreach clinic, work I'd done on my own time, unpaid, for 3 years running. I didn't fight it. I was too tired and too proud, and mostly I just wanted to be done being anyone's disappointment. Marjorie sat across the table for that final signing, watching me sign with the specific satisfaction of a woman who has just confirmed something she always suspected about a person's worth. I remember thinking, as I set the pen down, that she looked like a woman watching a stain finally lift out of a good tablecloth. Grady didn't come to that meeting. He sent a text instead, 4 words long, telling me he was sorry and that he hoped I'd be happy. I didn't answer it. I've thought since about what I would have said if I had, and I still don't know. Some silences you owe an explanation to. That one, I decided, could keep waiting. I didn't think about any of it again until almost a year later, standing in the hospital administration office with a cup of bad coffee, listening to the department secretary explain that Dr. Halloran, our current trauma medical director, was retiring at the end of the year, and that the search committee would be accepting nominations starting in September. "You should put your name in," she said. "You basically already run the outreach side of the program." "I might," I said, which was as far as I let myself commit to it out loud, because some habits from a marriage don't leave just because the marriage did. I found out an hour later, from a resident who couldn't keep a secret to save her life, that Palmer Quist had already been telling people in the surgeon's lounge that the position needed someone with, in his words, a steadier personal life. Someone without complications. He found me at the coffee station outside radiology that same afternoon, close enough to friendly that I almost missed the knife in it. "Solberg, heard you're thinking about Halloran's seat." "Thinking about it," I said. "Good instincts. Good hands. Nobody's arguing that." He stirred sugar into his coffee, not looking at me, which was somehow worse than if he had. He was 55, silver at the temples in the specific manner that reads as distinguished on a man, and would read as tired on anyone else, and he had run this department's day-to-day operations for 11 years without ever once, as far as I knew, having to fight for anything the way I was about to. It's a lot of committee work, though. A lot of politics, a lot of people watching how you handle pressure outside the OR too, especially with your particular situation, my particular situation. "The Larch family's given a great deal to this hospital over the years," he said, still stirring, still not looking at me. "Foundation dinners, the pediatric wing renovation. I'd just hate for anything personal to complicate a process that ought to be about merit." I stood there holding my coffee, watching a man I'd worked beside for 4 years threaten me so politely I almost thanked him for it, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, exactly what the next 6 months of my life were going to require of me. "Palmer," I said, "I've never once let anything personal complicate my work. I'd hate for you to be the first person in this hospital to suggest otherwise, where the committee can hear it." He smiled like I'd made a joke. I did not smile back. I walked away already composing, in my head, the exact list of everything I'd need to prove, to a committee that had never once had to prove anything about themselves, in a hospital hallway with an audience, I thought, walking back toward the trauma floor with my coffee going cold in my hand. About my mother pushing a cart through these same corridors for 26 years, doing work that kept this entire building running, while men like Palmer Quist decided who got to be called distinguished for doing less. I thought about Marjorie's chin lifting a fraction before she said the true thing underneath the polite thing. "Some people know exactly where they belong," she'd told me, meaning it as an insult. She had no idea how right she was. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the nomination form Halloran's secretary had handed me, blank except for my own name typed at the top, and understood that filling it out was going to be the easiest part of what was coming. Palmer Quist had just shown me exactly how he intended to fight. I had no idea yet how many more people from my old life were about to decide they had a stake in the outcome too. Chapter 4, The Director's Chair. I put my name in on a Wednesday, standing in the administration office in front of the same secretary who'd first mentioned the opening, signing a form that felt smaller in my hand than the moment deserved. "Good," she said, stamping it. "About time somebody who actually does the work put their name on it." I drove up to Sunnyside that evening without calling first, which my mother has never minded, since her door has never once in my whole life been locked to me. She was in the kitchen when I came in, a pot of pozole going on the back burner the way it always was on a Wednesday, because Astrid Solberg believes certain foods belong to certain days, the way other people believe in horoscopes. "You look like you're about to ask me something," she said. Without turning around, I put my name in for Halloran's job. She turned around then, wooden spoon still in her hand. And the smile that broke across her face was the same one I remembered from every school award, every acceptance letter, every milestone that had ever mattered to either of us. She didn't say congratulations. She never does, not right away. She just looked at me a long moment, the way she used to look at report cards, like she was reading something written between the lines of what I'd told her. Palmer Quist is going to make it ugly, she said. You know Palmer Quist. I've emptied that man's office trash for 11 years. Nadia, I know exactly who Palmer Quist is. She turned back to the pot, stirring. Unbothered in the specific way only my mother has ever managed to be unbothered by people like him. He tips his own coffee grounds directly into the wastebasket instead of the compost bin the hospital installed 2 years ago, even though there's a sign right above it. Man's never once in his life had to clean up a mess he made, and it shows in everything he does. I laughed for the first time in what felt like days. Sat down at the same folding table where I used to do algebra homework, now permanently retired to a corner of the kitchen and covered in mail, and let my mother feed me a bowl of the same pozole she'd been making since before I could walk. You're going to get it, she said, not as encouragement, just as fact, the way she'd say the sky was blue. Not because that family made you feel small for 4 years, because you're better at this than anyone else they've got. Those aren't the same reason. And don't you let anybody, including yourself, get them confused. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count. In the months since, I stayed later than I meant to that night, helping her dry dishes at the same sink I'd stood at as a kid, too short to reach the top cabinet without the step stool that still lived folded behind the pantry door. She asked me, drying a bowl slow and careful in that manner she does everything, whether I'd told my father's people about the nomination. The aunts and cousins scattered around Coconino County we saw twice a year at most. Not yet, I said. Tell them, she said. Not for them, for you. There's something about saying a good thing out loud to people who knew you when you had nothing. Nadia, it makes the good thing more real than it feels when you only say it to people who expected it of you all along. I didn't fully understand what she meant until months later. I understood it completely by the end of this year. Rowan and I started eating dinner together most nights we were both off, somewhere around the 3rd week of September. Though neither of us called it dinner together at the time, we called it debriefing. We called it going over Wesley's chart before his follow-up. We called it a dozen things that weren't the truth, which was that I had started arranging my schedule around his without admitting it to either of us. He told me about Kandahar over plates of green chile at a diner near the tracks downtown, the kind of place where the coffee comes in mugs older than either of us, and nobody rushes you out. 2 deployments as an army trauma surgeon, 4 years total, the kind of work that either breaks a person or makes them permanently unable to panic about anything smaller than what they'd already survived. I came back, and everybody wanted to know if I was okay, he said. Nobody ever asked if I was good at it. I was. That's a strange thing to sit with, being good at the worst day of somebody else's life, over and over for years. Is that why you never married? I asked, and immediately wished I could take the question back. Too direct, too much. He didn't seem to mind it. I married the job instead for a long time. Flagstaff felt like the right place to stop running from that. Something about the mountains. My grandfather worked timber outside Williams, and I used to think if I ever got tired enough of the world, I'd come back to something that quiet. He looked at me over his coffee. I got tired enough about 6 years ago. Been here since. And now I'm having dinner with a trauma surgeon who calls it a chart review, he said, and finding I don't mind the lie nearly as much as I probably should. I didn't have an answer for that one. I ate my green chili and let the moment sit there, warm and unclaimed, exactly as long as it needed to. Outside the diner window, the aspens up on the mountain had already started turning, gold pushing up through the green the way it does every September in a matter of days. Like the whole range decides at once that it's time. Rowan caught me looking and didn't say anything about it. Just let me watch the light change over his shoulder, and something about the not saying anything felt like its own kind of gift. I saw Grady for the first time since the divorce on a Saturday in early October, outside the old Santa Fe depot downtown, where I'd gone to meet my mother for the farmer's market that sets up there on weekends. He was alone, which surprised me. No Whitney, no stroller. He looked thinner than I remembered too, the whole family apparently shedding weight this season. And there was something in his face when he saw me that looked less like satisfaction and more like a man, walking toward a conversation he'd been rehearsing and dreading in equal measure. Nadia. He said my name like it cost him something. You look good, Grady. I heard about the job. The director thing. That's... He stopped, seemed to search for a word that wouldn't sound as hollow as whatever he'd first reached for. That's really something. Thank you. We stood there a moment in the thin October sun, tourists moving around us toward the farmer's market stalls, and I watched him work up to whatever he'd actually come to say, because I understood by then, better than I ever had during our marriage, exactly what his face looked like right before he said something he'd been avoiding. I think about it sometimes, he said. Before all of it. I know I don't get to say that to you. I know I gave up any right to say things like that to you. But I think about it, and I wonder if we don't. I said it gently. There's no version of this where I let myself pretend that was hard to say, because there was a version of this conversation where I could have let myself be cruel, and I chose not to be. Not because he'd earned my softness, but because I'd worked too hard to become someone who didn't need to be cruel to feel strong. Whatever you're about to ask me, the answer is no. It was no the day I found that statement, and it's no today. And it's going to keep being no every single time you think about asking it for the rest of both our lives. I'm not asking for you are, I said. You just don't have the nerve to finish the sentence, which is exactly the problem it always was. He flinched like I'd hit him, and for half a second I almost felt sorry for him. This man who used to drive to Sunnyside every Sunday and eat my mother's cooking like it was the best thing in the world, who had somehow ended up here, alone at a farmer's market, asking a woman he'd betrayed to consider taking him back. Is she good to you? I asked instead, softer. Whitney, is she good to you at least? Tell me it was worth what it cost. Something moved behind his eyes that I couldn't read, and for a moment I thought he might actually answer me honestly. I have to go, he said instead, and walked away toward the parking structure. And I stood there in the October sun with my mother's grocery bag already half full, watching him go, feeling nothing that even resembled the wreckage I'd expected to feel if this moment ever came. I felt, if anything, relieved. Like a door I'd been holding shut with my whole body had finally been allowed to close on its own. I didn't know yet that his mother was about to make sure none of us got to close that door quite as easily as I hoped. Chapter 5. Old Wounds. I told Rowan about Grady 2 days later. Sitting in his truck in the hospital parking structure at the end of a shift, both of us too tired to drive home yet. The particular tired that comes from a day with no single disaster, but 100 small ones stacked end to end. He wanted to know if I'd think about it, I said. Us. Again. Rowan didn't say anything right away, which was its own kind of answer, the way most of what mattered about him came out in what he didn't rush to fill. What did you tell him? No, clearly enough that I don't think he'll ask again. Good, he said. And then, like he'd surprised himself by saying it out loud, I've been trying for 2 months to figure out how to ask you something without it sounding like I was asking you to replace him. I didn't want to be the next guy in line behind a mistake. You're not in line behind anything, I said. I promise you that. He looked at me across the truck's dim cab. Streetlights coming on outside in the early dark that arrives fast in the mountains once October really sets in. And for a moment, I thought he might close the distance between us right there in a parking structure that smelled like exhaust and old rain. He didn't. He reached over instead and took my hand. Just that, his palm rough in the particular way surgeons' hands get rough no matter how careful you are with the gloves, and held it like it was something he intended to keep holding for longer than one night. I've got nowhere I need to be, he said, If you wanted to get dinner somewhere that isn't a diner near the tracks, I'd like that. There's a place off Beaver Street, he said. Nothing fancy. Good enchiladas. My landlord swears by it, and the man has strong opinions about very little else in life. So I've learned to trust him on this one thing, I laughed, and it surprised me how easy laughing had gotten to be in his company. After a year of measuring every laugh against whether it would be reported back to a mother-in-law at some future family dinner, I no longer had to attend. Ask me properly, I said. Not chart review, not debriefing. He turned in his seat to face me fully, and for a man who'd spent 2 deployments learning not to flinch at anything, he looked in that moment almost nervous. Nadia Solberg, he said, would you have dinner with me? On purpose. Where we both admit that's what it is. Yes, I said. I would. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't a declaration. It was a hand held in a parking structure by a man who had learned the hard way that the biggest things in life rarely announce themselves with fireworks. And it was, that October evening. Exactly enough. The committee process moved slower than I wanted and faster than I was ready for. Both at once, the way most things worth having tend to move. I sat 2 formal interviews, presented outreach clinic numbers I'd been quietly tracking for 3 years without ever imagining I'd need them for anything but my own satisfaction, and fielded in the hallway outside radiology at least 4 more conversations with Palmer Quist that were technically polite and functionally about nothing except reminding me he was still in the race. His candidate was a good surgeon named Dr. Okonkwo Reyes, 2 years my senior, perfectly qualified, and, as far as I could tell from 3 separate conversations, not particularly interested in the politics being run on his behalf. I liked him, actually. I made a point of telling him so once, in the surgeon's lounge, because I'd decided somewhere in October that I refused to let this process turn me into someone who resented a decent colleague for another man's maneuvering. I didn't ask Quist to do any of that, he told me, looking almost embarrassed. For what it's worth, I believe you, I said, and meant it. I mentored a second-year resident named Farah that same stretch of weeks, a sharp, nervous young woman from Tuba City, who reminded me enough of myself at her age that I started staying an extra hour most Thursdays just to walk her through cases twice. Slow in a manner nobody had ever quite managed for me. Halloran, still technically running the department until his retirement took effect, mentioned to me in passing that how I'd handled Farah's training had come up, unprompted, in a committee conversation. They're not just watching how you operate. Solberg, he said. They're watching who you're building behind you. I thought about my mother's words at her kitchen table. Not the same reason. I held on to that, the way you hold on to a rail on a trail, with a long drop on one side. Farah froze during a difficult repair that same week, hands hovering over a bleed she'd correctly identified but couldn't quite make herself commit to closing. And I talked her through it in the same low, steady voice Rowan had used on me during Wesley's surgery, the voice that says nothing about the stakes and everything about the fact that you are not alone in this room. Afterwards, scrubbing out, she told me she'd almost quit her residency twice in the last year. Certain she didn't have whatever unnameable thing the attendings around her all seemed to have been born with. Nobody's born with it, I told her. I grew up watching doctors move through hallways like they owned the air in them, and I promise you, every single one of them learned that walk. Some of us just started learning it younger, out of necessity is all. She looked at me like I'd handed her something she planned to keep for a long time. I recognized the look. I'd worn it myself once, watching my mother's cart roll past an OR door. The call came on a Tuesday, the way the worst calls tend to, though it wasn't a call at all, so much as a text from Priya. 3 words long, sent to the group chain, half our floor still used from a training cohort 5 years back. Larch-coded. Coming in, I was off that day, standing in my own kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand. And I felt the floor of my stomach drop out the exact way it had in that hallway 3 weeks ago. Except this time, there was no cruelty in the room to brace against, only distance. and the particular helplessness of being the one person in Flagstaff most qualified to help and the one person with the least right to offer it. I called Rowan instead of driving in uninvited, because some boundaries I'd built for myself over the last 10 months I still believed in. Even now, she's stable, he told me out of breath, clearly moving fast down a hallway I could picture without needing to see it. Collapsed at home. Housekeeper found her. Cardiology's got her, not us, not yet, but Nadia, what? They're saying she's been symptomatic for months, refusing to tell anyone. Her own son didn't know how bad it had gotten until an hour ago. She's asking for Grady right now, not for you, before you wonder. I just thought you'd want to know she's talking already. That's a good sign. But this soon out, I stood in my kitchen a long moment after he hung up, coffee forgotten, thinking about a woman who had spent a lifetime deciding exactly how much of herself the world was allowed to see, and had apparently decided, even with her own heart failing her, that fear was not a thing she was willing to let anyone witness. I thought about the hand pressed flat to her chest in that hallway. I thought, God help me, about how frightened she must have been. Every single day since, walking around with the secret her own body was keeping better than she was. I did not go to the hospital that day. I told myself it wasn't my place, and mostly I believed it. You okay? Rowan asked before he hung up, something careful in his voice that told me he already knew the answer. I looked out my kitchen window at the peaks going dark against a sky still holding the last orange edge of sunset. The same mountains that had watched over every version of me this town had ever produced. The algebra kid, and the resident, and the surgeon, and the ex-wife, and whatever I was tonight. Standing barefoot on cold tile, worrying about a woman who had spent a year making sure I understood I wasn't welcome to worry about her. I don't know yet, I said, which was the most honest answer I had. My phone buzzed against the counter behind me. Once then again, a number I hadn't seen light up my screen in months. I didn't answer it. I let it sit there glowing while I finished my cold coffee and told myself whatever it was could wait until morning. It could not, as it turned out, wait even that long. Chapter 6. What Marjorie Never Said. Grady found me in the hospital cafeteria 3 days after his mother's collapse, which told me, before he said a single word, exactly how frightened he still was. I was having a late lunch alone, the kind surgeons eat standing half the time, and I looked up to find him standing at the end of my table with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets like a boy waiting outside a principal's office. I know I have no right, he said. I know that better than anyone, but you're the only person in my life who actually understands what these people are telling us. And I can't get a straight answer out of anyone on a care team that doesn't sound like it's been run through a legal department first. I set down my fork. Grady, I'm trauma. I'm not on her case. I'm not asking you to treat her. I'm asking you to translate. Cardiology keeps saying things like ventricular arrhythmia and ablation candidate, and I don't know what any of it means. And my mother won't ask a single question in front of me because she doesn't want to look scared. I recognized that. God help me. I recognized every piece of it, the specific family choreography of a larch, determined not to be witnessed in a weak moment. I had spent 4 years of marriage learning that particular dance, the way that family treated fear like a stain that had to be scrubbed out before company arrived, even when the company was your own son. Grady looked worse up close than he had at the farmer's market, hollowed out in a way that had nothing to do with weight and everything to do with sleep he clearly hadn't been getting. Whatever else I felt about this man, and there was still plenty I felt, none of it stretched far enough to cover watching him fall apart alone in a cafeteria over his mother's heart. Sit down, I said. I spent 20 minutes explaining, in plain terms, what an arrhythmia workup meant, what an ablation was, why doctors sometimes waited to see how a heart behaved before deciding on a more invasive fix. I kept my voice level and clinical, the way I would for any family, and Grady listened like a drowning man being handed a rope, nodding, asking real questions for the first time since I'd known him. "Thank you," he said when I finished. "I mean that, not as an opening for anything else. Just thank you." "You're welcome," I said, and meant it too, and understood, watching him walk away toward the elevators, that some doors don't fully close just because you've decided they should. They just change what's allowed to pass through them. Palmerquist heard about the cafeteria conversation by the next morning, which surprised me exactly not at all in a hospital this size, and he requested a private meeting with the search committee chair that same afternoon that I only learned about because Halloran, bless him, told me directly instead of letting me hear it second-hand. "He's raising a conflict of interest," Halloran said, leaning against his own office doorframe, arms crossed, looking more tired than angry. "Says with your former mother-in-law an active patient in this system, and your former husband apparently seeking you out for consults. The appearance of impropriety alone should be enough to pause your nomination until the situation resolves." I didn't seek him out. He came to me. "I know that, Nadia. I believe you. The question is whether the committee needs to hear you explain it, or whether Palmer's already made sure they'll hear his version." First, I stood in that doorway feeling something harden in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the particular fury of watching a man weaponize my own decency against me. I had explained a diagnosis to a frightened son. That was the entirety of my crime. "Let the committee ask me whatever they want," I said. "I'm not going to apologize for treating a scared man like a human being, just because his mother spent a hallway conversation reminding me I wasn't one." Halloran almost smiled. "That's the answer I was hoping you'd give me. Write it up formally, though. Committees like paper better than they like conviction, no matter how good the conviction sounds in a doorway." I went home that night and wrote 3 pages explaining exactly what had happened. In plain factual language, no defensiveness in it, because I had learned by then, the hard way, that the truth written down carefully was worth infinitely more than the truth spoken in anger to the wrong audience. Rowan found me still at it past 10 that night, laptop open on my kitchen table, 3 empty mugs of tea gone cold around me, like evidence of how long I'd been circling the same 3 pages. "Halloran told me what Quist's trying," he said, pulling out the chair across from me without asking. "For what it's worth, I already emailed the committee chair myself. Told them I was in that cafeteria doorway when Grady approached you, that you tried to send him to his mother's actual care team twice before you gave in, and explained the terminology in plain English because the man was clearly drowning. I told them if translating a diagnosis for a frightened family member disqualifies a surgeon from leadership, half this hospital should resign by Friday. You didn't have to do that. I know I didn't." He reached across the table and turned my laptop screen gently toward himself, reading a few lines, then turned it back. "This is good, clear, doesn't beg for anyone's sympathy, which is exactly right, because you don't need it. You need the truth on paper where Quist can't reshape it into something it wasn't." I looked at him across my own kitchen table. Tea gone cold, the whole ugly machinery of the last 10 months humming somewhere underneath this ordinary Tuesday, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't let myself feel in longer than I could easily count, not rescue. That distinction matters more than it might sound like it should. He hadn't fixed anything. He'd simply stood next to me while I fixed it myself, which turned out to be an entirely different thing, and a far better one. Marjorie was discharged 5 days after her collapse. Against, I heard through the hospital's endless and reliable grapevine, the strong recommendation of her own cardiologist, who wanted at least another week of monitoring before clearing her for anything resembling a normal schedule. She refused. She told Dr. Ferro, according to Priya, who had it from a nurse on the cardiology floor, that she had spent quite enough of her life in hospital gowns and intended to recover in her own home. On her own terms, "Thank you very much," she was told, explicitly not to drive. Not alone, not for at least 2 weeks. Not until a follow-up study confirmed the medication adjustment was holding. Grady offered to stay with her. So apparently, did a cousin from Sedona, a woman named Blythe. I'd met exactly once at a wedding, and remembered mostly for her kindness to the caterers. Marjorie declined both, just as she'd declined most offers of help in the 63 years of her life. As though needing anyone at all was a debt she refused to carry, even from her own family. Even now, she told Blythe she'd rather have a second episode alone than have someone hovering over her like she'd already died. Grady told me, the disbelief in his voice traveling clean through the phone line. I don't understand her, Nadia. I've spent 37 years trying to understand her, and I still don't. She's already driving herself to her own follow-ups. Won't let anyone come. Says she's fine. I don't know what to do with her. I never have. I understood her better than I wanted to, if I'm honest. I understood a woman who had built her entire identity on being the one who managed everyone else's crisis, never the one having it, and who would apparently rather risk her own life than let the world see her needing to be managed in return. It was the same instinct, I realized, standing in my kitchen with the phone warm against my ear, that had made her drive 40 minutes to a hospital hallway to remind me I didn't matter. The week her own heart had already started failing her in secret. Control applied everywhere she could reach it, because the one place she couldn't control anything at all terrified her too much to look at directly. I told myself, after I hung up, that it wasn't my business, that I had drawn a line and intended to keep it, that a woman who had spent her whole life refusing to be managed by anyone was not about to start being managed by me. I believed that, mostly right up until the storm rolled in that Thursday and didn't stop. Chapter 7. The Storm on Lake Mary Road. The storm that Thursday came in sideways, the way they do sometimes in the high country. Rain turning to hail, turning back to rain in the space of 20 minutes. Visibility dropping to almost nothing along the roads that wind south out of town, through the ponderosa pines toward the lakes. Lake Mary Road floods and iced in equal measure depending on the season, and locals know to slow down the moment the pines start swaying, the way they'd been swaying since sundown that night. Branches whipping hard enough to shed needles across the asphalt like a second kind of rain. I was on call. I want to be clear that I was on call before I knew anything about who was coming. That I would have answered this page exactly the same way for anyone in Coconino County that night, because that's the job. And I have never once let anything personal change how I do the job. The radio call came through at 8:52 p.m. Single vehicle rollover, Lake Mary Road near the Upper Lake turnoff. One occupant, unresponsive at scene, extraction in progress. ETA 14 minutes. I was already moving toward the trauma bay, already running the mental checklist that 6 years of training had worn into a groove, so deep I didn't have to think through it anymore. When the second transmission came through with the patient's name, pulled from a wallet found in the wreckage, Marjorie Larch, 63, known cardiac history. I stood very still for exactly 1 second, in a hallway that suddenly felt like it was tilting. And then I did the only thing I have ever known how to do with a fact that threatens to become bigger than the moment can hold. I set it down. Not away, just down, on a shelf somewhere I could return to later, and I picked up a pair of gloves instead. Rowan found me at the trauma bay doors. You want me to take this one? No. I said it before I'd even fully decided it, and then I understood, hearing it out loud, that it was true. No, I want to be the one in that room. If something happens to her and I wasn't the one who tried, I don't think I could live with what that says about who I let this family turn me into. He held my eyes a long moment, reading something there I couldn't have named myself. And then he nodded. Then let's go save her life, he said, and pulled the doors open. She came in worse than the initial call suggested, which happens more often than television ever tells people. Blood pressure dropping fast, abdomen rigid. The unmistakable signature of significant internal bleeding, most likely from the liver given the mechanism. The seatbelt bruising already darkening along her ribs in the shape of the very device that had probably kept the crash from being instantly fatal. I made the call to open her within 11 minutes of her arrival. I'm not going to describe every detail of that surgery. Because some things belong to the operating room and stay there, but I will say this. I've never worked harder to save a life I had every earthly reason to resent. I found the laceration on the fourth exploration of her liver's surface. Packed it, controlled it, watched her pressure climb back toward. Something survivable, while a nurse called out numbers in a voice gone. Tight with the particular focus a room gets when everyone in it understands exactly how close. The margin is, somewhere in the middle of it, and inside a body that had spent a year teaching me I wasn't worth loving. I thought about my mother's words at her kitchen table. Not the same reason. I was not saving Marjorie Larch because I had forgiven her. I want that understood clearly by anyone who might mistake what happened in that operating room for some kind of grace I hadn't yet earned the right to withhold. I was saving her because I had taken an oath a long time before I ever met her, in a building not far from this one, and because the entire architecture of who I had built myself into, since the divorce depended on being a person whose integrity didn't have exceptions carved into it for people who'd hurt me. Hating her would have been easy. Letting her die on my table because some small, exhausted part of me believed she deserved it would have been the easiest thing I had ever done in an operating room. I chose the harder thing instead, the way I had chosen it every day since March. And 2 hours and 40 minutes after we opened her, Marjorie Larch's vital signs stabilized enough for me to close. Grady was waiting in the surgical family lounge when I came out, still in the clothes he'd apparently thrown on when the highway patrol called him. Hair unwashed, looking like he hadn't sat down once in 3 hours. She's stable, I told him before he could ask, because I have delivered enough news in enough family lounges to know the only mercy worth giving is speed. The surgery went as well as it could have gone. There's real risk in the next 48 hours. There always is with an injury like hers. But her body responded the way we needed it to. He sat down hard on the vinyl couch behind him, both hands coming up to cover his face, and for a moment the only sound in the lounge was the rain still hammering the skylights 3 floors up. I keep thinking about the drive she made to come find you, he said, not lifting his head. 40 minutes on purpose to say something cruel to a woman who'd never once been anything but decent to this family. I used to tell myself that was just how she loved people. Fiercely, maybe too fiercely, but love underneath it somewhere. I'm having a harder time believing that tonight than I have in 37 years of practice believing it. You saved her, he said into his hands when he finally looked up. After what she did to you in that hallway, after everything. You saved her anyway. I'm a surgeon, I said again, because it was the truest thing I had. The sentence I would apparently be repeating to this family until one of us finally believed it meant exactly what it said, and nothing more. That's the whole job. Grady, it doesn't come with conditions. He looked up at me then, eyes red, and for the first time since the divorce, I saw something in his face that wasn't guilt dressed up as longing. It looked instead like the beginning of actual shame, the kind that doesn't ask anything of the person who caused it, the kind that just sits with itself and starts slowly to change something underneath. Thank you, he said. I know I don't get to ask anything else of you. I'm not going to. I just needed to say that. I nodded and left him there in the lounge with his face in his hands and went to find a cup of coffee I didn't particularly want. Because I needed 5 minutes alone before I could go check on the patient whose life I'd just spent everything I had protecting. She surfaced from anesthesia the next morning in the particular disoriented fog that follows a surgery like hers. Tubes and monitors and the low beep of machines keeping careful watch, and I was there when she opened her eyes. Not because I needed to be, but because Grady had asked me to be. In a voice too exhausted to argue with, and because some part of me had needed to see for myself that she was still breathing on this side of what I'd done to her body to save it. Her eyes found mine before they found her son's. You, she said, voice thick and slurred, not fully present yet, the anesthesia still pulling at the edges of whatever filter she'd spent 63 years building around herself. "You came. You're at Flagstaff Medical," I said gently, the way I've said it to 100 confused patients before her. "You were in an accident. You're safe now." She reached out with the hand that wasn't tethered to a line, gripped my wrist with a strength that surprised me. "Given everything her body had just survived, I didn't think you'd come," she said, and something in her face cracked open that I had genuinely never seen there before. Not once, in 4 years of marriage and a decade of knowing her. "After everything I said to you, I didn't think anyone would come. I'm a surgeon, Marjorie. It's my job to come. No." Her grip tightened, unsteady, urgent in a way the sedation should have made impossible. No, that's not. Nadia, there's something I have to tell you about the divorce. About what I did. I have to tell you before. Her eyes fluttered, the sedation pulling her back under exactly as suddenly as it had let her surface, her hand going slack around my wrist mid-sentence, the words dissolving into the same fog she'd just fought her way out of. I stood there in the recovery room, with my pulse suddenly loud in my own ears, staring down at a woman whose life I had just spent 2 hours and 40 minutes fighting to save, and understood that whatever she had almost told me, she had been carrying it long enough and guiltily enough that even a body shredded by trauma and anesthesia had tried to fight through the fog to finally say it out loud. I didn't sleep that night, waiting for her to wake up again. Chapter 8. What Fear Sounds Like. She woke fully the following afternoon, clear-eyed this time, no fog left to hide behind, and she asked the nurse, before she asked for water, before she asked for Grady, whether Dr. Solberg was still in the building. I came when they called me. I told myself it was professional courtesy, checking on a complicated post-op patient, and that was even partly true. She looked smaller in the bed than she had ever looked standing up. Hair flat against the pillow, the cashmere armor stripped away along with everything else the hospital strips from you the moment you become a patient. Instead of a person who gets to decide how she's seen, I meant to tell you yesterday, she said, before I'd even finished crossing the room. I've been trying to work up the courage for a year. And yesterday, coming up out of that anesthesia, it just came out, and then it didn't finish coming out. And I've been lying here since, terrified you'd think I lost the nerve again. You don't owe me anything, Marjorie. I did my job. That's the whole of it. I owe you everything. Her voice cracked on the word, and for the first time in a decade of knowing this woman, I watched her let herself be seen falling apart. I knew about Whitney before the divorce. Not details, not at first, but I knew Grady was pulling away from you, and when I found out why, I didn't tell you. I told myself it wasn't my place. That was a lie. The truth is, I was relieved. The word landed in that quiet room like something dropped from a height. Relieved, I repeated. You were never going to give me what I wanted for this family. Nadia, not because you weren't good enough. Because you were too good for what I wanted. You'd have kept working at that clinic on 4th Street until you retired, kept driving that same car, kept your mother close, instead of quietly easing her into the background, the way I'd hoped Grady's wife would understand was expected. Whitney understood what was expected. You never did, and some ugly, frightened part of me decided that made you the problem instead of me. Behind me, the door opened. Grady stood in the frame, apparently arrived in time to hear most of it. His face gone the color of old paper. "Mom, you should hear this too," Marjorie said. And something in her voice now had gone past fear into something closer to relief. The particular relief of a person finally setting down a weight they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it was optional. I told Osgood to leave the outreach clinic off the settlement paperwork. The equity you'd earned running it those 3 years, unpaid, on your own time. I knew it belonged to you. I told him you were too proud to fight for it, that you'd sign whatever we put in front of you rather than draw out the process. And I was right, wasn't I? You signed it in 11 minutes. The room went very quiet. Somewhere down the hall, a cartwheel squeaked against linoleum. Ordinary and enormous all at once. You manipulated a legal settlement, I said, very carefully. Because you decided I was too proud to check the paperwork. Yes, Mom. How could you? Grady's voice broke entirely, and he sat down hard in the visitor's chair, like his legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him. You let me think the divorce was clean. You let me believe walking away with nothing but the accounts was fair. You've been letting me believe you were the only person in this family who ever did anything decent. And this whole time, I was trying to protect this family, Marjorie said. But even she seemed to hear how thin it sounded now, spoken out loud in a recovery room with monitors still beeping steady behind her. I don't expect either of you to understand that. I'm not certain I understand it myself anymore. She was quiet a moment, staring at the ceiling tile instead of either of us. And when she spoke again, her voice had gone somewhere further away. My own mother cleaned houses in Sedona for 20 years before she married my father, she said. Large money, old money, the kind of family that never once let her forget where she'd started. I was 11 years old the first time my grandmother corrected my mother's grammar at a dinner table, exactly the way I corrected yours. Nadia, and I promised myself, sitting there watching her take it and say nothing, that I would never again in my life be the person at that end of the table. I just never noticed I'd become my grandmother instead. Not until you were sitting across from me being exactly as gracious about it as my mother always was, and something in me couldn't stand to watch it happen twice. That doesn't undo what you did, I said, gently because it needed saying and because some part of me, God help me, ached for the 11-year-old girl she'd just described. I know that. I think I'm so afraid of losing this family's place in this town that I decided the ends justified whatever I had to do to secure it. And I think I have been afraid every day since of exactly this moment, of finally being seen clearly by the two people whose good opinion I apparently wanted more than I ever let myself admit, including my own son. I stood at the foot of that bed a long moment, looking at a woman who had just handed me, freely and without prompting, the exact shape of the wrong done to me, and felt something inside myself go very still and very clear. Thank you for telling me the truth, I said. I mean that. It took courage, and I don't think courage has ever come easily to you. So I want you to hear me say, I noticed. Her eyes filled. But I need you to understand something too, Marjorie, because I think you're hoping this confession buys you something I'm not able to give you today. I'm glad you're alive. I fought for 2 hours and 40 minutes to make sure of it, and I'd do it again tomorrow without hesitating, because that's who I decided to become long before I ever met you. But being glad you're alive isn't the same thing as forgiving you. I don't know if I'll ever get there. I'm not going to perform getting there today just because you're finally ready to hear it. I'm not asking you to, she said, quiet now, something almost like respect moving behind the tears. I don't think I have any right left to ask you for anything at all. No, I said. You don't. I looked at Grady, still sitting in that chair like the floor had opened beneath him. Grief and fury, and something that might eventually, years from now, grow into genuine understanding, all fighting for space on his face at once. Take care of your mother, I told him. That part's still yours to do, whatever else changes today. Nadia. He caught my hand as I turned for the door, not pleading this time, something steadier in it. For what it's worth. I'm going to find out exactly what she did, all of it, and I'm going to make sure it's made right, whether you ever forgive either of us or not. I owe you that much independent of anything you decide to do about it. That would be the first genuinely brave thing I've ever seen you do, I said. And I meant it as neither insult nor comfort. It was simply true, and we both knew it. I walked out of that room with my pulse steady and my hands perfectly still. And it wasn't until I reached the elevator bank, alone, doors closing in front of me, that I let myself finally understand what Marjorie had just handed me, not an apology, evidence, 3 years of unpaid labor at that clinic, and a legal settlement deliberately structured to make sure I never saw $1 of what it was worth. Confirmed out loud by the very woman who'd orchestrated it, I rode down 4 floors, thinking about my mother's kitchen table, About the words she'd have used if I called her right now, to tell her what I'd just heard. Don't get even. Nadia, get everything that's already yours. I thought too. About the 11-year-old girl at a dinner table in a house I'd never see, watching her own mother swallow an insult whole, because the alternative was unthinkable. I found I could hold two things at once without either one cancelling the other out. I could believe Marjorie Larch's fear was real, inherited, older than either of us, passed down a family line like a piece of bad silver nobody had the courage to melt down, and I could still, in the very same breath, refuse to let that fear cost me one more thing than it already had. Compassion and consequence had never once, in my experience, required each other's permission to coexist. By the time the elevator doors opened onto the ground floor, I'd already decided to call a lawyer in the morning. Chapter 9. Everything Earned. I met with a family law attorney my mother's neighbor had used for her own divorce years earlier. A careful, unhurried woman who listened to the whole account without once interrupting, then pulled up Arizona's rules on marital settlement agreements and started making notes in the margins of a legal pad. Fraudulent inducement, potentially if we can show the omission was deliberate and not just an oversight, she said. But we don't need to prove fraud in a courtroom to get this fixed. We have your own timesheets from the outreach clinic. We have the grant paperwork showing the equity structure the hospital foundation set up for physicians who built and ran community programs on their own time. We have 3 years of documentation that this work existed, that it was yours, and that it was worth something real. That's not a story anyone has to argue about. That's just what the papers say. She tapped the legal pad twice, like she was underlining the point for her own benefit as much as mine. I've done this 100 times, Dr. Solberg. The clients who come in wanting a courtroom, wanting the other side humiliated in front of a judge. They spend 2 years and a great deal of money to end up about where you'll end up in a few weeks, doing this quietly. You already have everything you need. You just needed someone to help you use it. No recordings, no courtroom drama, no gallery of family members watching me win. Just a demand letter, built entirely from documents that had been sitting in a file cabinet the whole time, waiting for someone to finally go looking. Osgood, the Larch family lawyer, called mine within 4 days of receiving it. The settlement was amended within 3 weeks, quietly, the equity valued and transferred without a single headline, without a single dramatic scene in a hallway. I found out later that Grady had been the one pushing Osgood to move fast, calling twice a week to ask why it was taking so long, which was, I'll admit, not nothing. Grady came to my mother's house on a Sunday in November, which took a particular kind of nerve I hadn't expected from him. Standing on Astrid Solberg's porch with a folder in his hands like a man delivering a verdict on himself. "I'm not staying," he said when I opened the door. "I just wanted to bring you this myself, instead of letting Osgood mail it. It's everything. The corrected settlement and something else besides." My mother stepping back from the foundation board. I asked her to. It felt like the smallest possible start. I took the folder. "Thank you. I know we're done," he said. And something in the way he said it told me he'd finally truly arrived at understanding it. Not as a punishment being handed to him, but as a fact he'd earned the hard way. "I'm not here for anything else. I just wanted you to see me try to be the kind of person who actually fixes what he breaks, even when fixing it doesn't buy him anything back." "That's good." "Grady," I said, and I meant it without any bitterness left in it at all, which surprised me more than it probably should have. "I hope you keep being that person. Not for me, for whoever comes next." He nodded, turned, and walked back down my mother's porch steps into a cold November afternoon, and I watched him go without feeling the floor tilt even slightly beneath me. The door, the one I'd told him back in October was closing on its own, had finished closing sometime in the weeks between then and now, so quietly I'd barely noticed the latch catch. The committee announced its decision on the first Monday in December, in an email I read standing in the surgeon's lounge with Rowan beside me. both of us still in scrubs from a case that had run long, effective January 1st. Dr. Nadia Solberg will serve as trauma medical director. I read it twice before I let myself believe it. Halloran found me 20 minutes later, still holding my phone like it might change its answer if I looked away. For what it's worth, it wasn't close. Your outreach numbers, Wesley's case, how you handled the conflict of interest question in writing instead of getting defensive about it in a hallway somewhere. The committee talked about that memo for 20 minutes. Palmer didn't have anything left to argue with by the end, and Dr. Okonkwo-Reyes sent you a very gracious email an hour ago. You should read it. Ben's got more class than the person who tried to use him. I found Palmer Quist at the coffee station outside radiology that same afternoon, in almost the exact spot he'd cornered me back in September, and I watched him decide visibly whether to say something about it. He didn't. He nodded once, said, "Congratulations, Director," in a voice that cost him something to produce, and walked away. I let him have that much dignity. I'd earned enough by then that I didn't need to take it from him too. I called my mother from the parking structure before I'd even started my car, sitting in the cold with my breath fogging the windshield, unable to wait until I got home to tell her. "They picked me," I said, and then I couldn't say anything else for a moment, because 26 years of watching her push a cart through these same hallways had just caught up with me all at once, sitting there in the dark. She didn't say congratulations, not right away. She never does. I heard her set something down on her kitchen counter, heard the particular silence of my mother deciding a moment mattered too much to fill with the first thing that came to mind. "Your father would have worn a hole in the floor, pacing about this," she finally said, voice thick. "He always said you came out of me already looking for the next hard thing to be good at. I used to think that was going to be difficult for you, wanting so much. I don't think that anymore. I love you, Mama. I know it," she said. "Go on and celebrate properly. Tell that Rowan I expect him at Christmas dinner, and tell him I make my pozole from a recipe he is not allowed to ask questions about." Rowan found me on the roof access landing that night, the one surgeons use to catch 5 minutes of sky between cases. Snow starting to fall for the first time that season, fine and quiet over the lights of downtown. "Director Solberg," he said, testing the words out like he wanted to see how they'd sit in his mouth for the rest of his life. "I like the sound of that. It's got a nice weight to it." I agreed. He was quiet a moment, snow catching in his dark hair, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost the easy teasing. "I've been thinking about something since that parking structure in October," he said. "About how I told you I didn't want to be the next guy in line behind a mistake. I don't think that's what this is anymore, Nadia. I don't think it's been that in a long time. I think I just love you plainly, the way I should have said months ago, instead of hiding it inside dinner invitations." I looked at this man who had walked into my worst hallway and pulled me toward a 9-year-old who needed saving, who had written a letter to a committee defending my character without being asked, who had never once tried to fix a single thing in my life that wasn't his to fix, only stood beside me while I fixed it myself. "I love you too," I said. "I have for a while. I just didn't want to say it before I'd finished becoming someone I was proud to say it as." He kissed me then, on a rooftop landing in the year's first snow, 400 feet above the hallway, where a woman had once told me I'd never be enough for anyone. And for the first time in longer than I could easily measure, I believed completely that she had simply been wrong. "Come to my mother's for Christmas," I said against his jacket, snow settling on both our shoulders. "She's already asked about you twice. I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that more than almost anything. Somewhere below us, the hospital hummed on the way it always did. Other people's worst nights unfolding in rooms I couldn't see from here. And I understood, standing in the snow with a man who had never once needed to rescue me, that the last piece of this year still waiting to be closed wasn't down there in the building at all. It was one more conversation, still owed, with a woman recovering 4 floors below the room where I'd once let her believe she'd won. Chapter 10. What the Peaks Know. I went to see Marjorie once more before the year turned over. On a grey afternoon between Christmas and New Year's, when the whole town seemed to be holding its breath between one thing ending and another beginning. I didn't tell Rowan I was going. I didn't tell my mother either. This felt like something I owed only to myself. The way certain doors need to be closed by the same hand that opened them. She was home by then, recovering well, according to Grady, who still texted me updates I hadn't asked for and had stopped minding receiving. Forest Highlands looked smaller in December than I remembered it. Snow, softening the hedges I used to think were the most intimidating thing about that house. Back when I was 26 and certain that manicured shrubbery meant something about a person's worth. Marjorie answered her own door, which surprised me. She looked steadier than she had in that hospital bed, colour back in her face, though something in her had gone permanently quieter. The way a house sounds different after a storm has taken something off the roof. I didn't think you'd come, she said, an echo of the recovery room, and I heard her catch the echo too, watched her flinch slightly at her own words. I won't stay long, I said. I mostly came to say something out loud, so you'd hear it from me directly instead of secondhand from Grady. She stepped back to let me into the entryway. Not the whole house, just far enough that we weren't having this conversation on a doorstep in the cold. And I understood that as its own kind of honesty, neither of us pretending this was a visit that called for tea in the good china. The house looked different to me than it had on any of the dozens of times I'd stood in it as a daughter-in-law. Smaller somehow, the good furniture just furniture now instead of a verdict on who belonged near it. I noticed, for the first time, a framed photograph on the entry table of Marjorie as a young woman, dark-haired, laughing at something outside the frame. A version of her I'd never once been shown in 10 years of knowing this family. I'm not going to forgive you today, I said. I don't know if I'll ever get all the way there, and I've stopped pretending to either of us that I owe you a timeline for it. But I wanted you to know I'm not carrying what happened between us the way I was carrying it in October. The settlement's corrected. The job is mine. My mother is proud of me, and I'm proud of myself. And none of that required your blessing to become true, which I think is the part you always misunderstood about me. I know that now, she said quiet. I hope you get well. I mean that plainly, the way I meant it in that operating room. I hope you find whatever it is you actually needed all along, because I don't think it was ever the things you spent your whole life protecting. I think it was just permission to stop being afraid, and I hope you find a way to give that to yourself that doesn't require costing anyone else what it cost me. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had none of the polish left in it at all. Thank you for coming, she said. I won't ask you to come again. I think I finally understand that isn't mine to ask for anymore. No, I said. It isn't. I left her standing in that entryway, snow starting to fall again, outside the leaded glass beside her door. And I drove back down out of Forest Highlands, with the windows cracked despite the cold, letting the pine air clear out something in my chest that had been sitting heavy there for the better part of a year. Farah caught me in the parking structure on my last shift of the year, still in scrubs, a card in her hand she looked almost embarrassed to be holding. The residents wanted to do something for the new director, she said, and everyone else wanted balloons, which felt wrong for you somehow. So I got you this instead. Inside was a photograph of the outreach clinic on 4th Street, the one I'd built up over 3 unpaid years. Taken sometime that fall, with a line of patients waiting outside in the kind of quiet dignity nobody ever photographs on purpose. Underneath, in Farah's careful hand, she'd written, "Some people know exactly where they belong. Thank you for showing me it could be here." I had to turn away for a moment, blinking hard against the cold. I didn't know you knew that line, I said. You told me the story once. About what she said to you. I've thought about it more than you'd probably like to know. Farah shrugged, sudden and shy. I just wanted you to have better words attached to it than the ones she gave you. Rowan was waiting at my mother's table when I got back to Sunnyside. The two of them deep in an argument about whether his landlord's enchilada place really did have better red chili than hers. An argument I suspected she was enjoying far too much to ever actually concede. "You look lighter," he said when I sat down beside him. "I am." He didn't ask where I'd been. I told him anyway later, walking home from my mother's through streets gone hushed with fresh snow, past the co-op and the empty lot where the farmer's market used to set up before it moved, past the 6 blocks I used to walk with my mother's hand around mine on the way to Killip Elementary. The peaks rising dark and enormous against a sky just beginning to clear. Stars showing through in the gaps between clouds the way they only do at 7,000 feet. Close enough to touch. "I used to think this town was too small to hold what I wanted," I said. "Now I think it's the only place that could have built the person who was actually capable of wanting it. 10 months ago, I said, a woman stood in a hospital hallway and asked me to believe that losing her family was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. And now? I stopped walking, looked up at the San Francisco peaks standing sentinel over the whole valley the way they'd stood over every version of me this town had ever produced. The algebra kid, the resident, the wife, the ex-wife, the surgeon, the director, the woman walking home through the snow with a man who had never once needed to rescue her from anything. Now I think losing that family was the year I finally found out who I actually was without it," I said. "I think Marjorie asked me a question in that hallway she never expected me to actually answer. Is that really what you believe? I've been answering it every single day since, just not with words. With this life. This whole enormous, unmanaged, entirely mine life." Rowan took my hand, the same way he had in that parking structure months ago, like something he intended to keep holding for a long time yet. "For what it's worth," he said, "I believe every word of your answer. Above us, the peaks held the last of the daylight the way they always do this time of year. Patient and unbothered by anything so small as a single family's cruelty, or a single woman's reckoning, or the particular. Heard one piece of finally walking home exactly as yourself. I believed it too. For the first time in longer than I could measure, I believed it completely.